Welcome to Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. for the launch of our new exhibition, Ancient Faith, the Churches of Nagorno-Karabakh. Through this exhibition, we invite people around the world to explore the sacred spaces, Christian culture, and stories of the people who have lived and worshiped in ARTSAKH. We hope that our guests in the exhibition learn about these sites, in many cases, I'm guessing, for the first time, that they understand their history, learn about the people who live and worship in these places, come to appreciate their beauty, and especially understand the need to preserve these sites intact. Tragically, war and political conflict has put these sites at risk of alteration and even destruction. There was open conflict over this territory in 1994, and again, as you likely saw in the news, only 8 months ago. Sites were damaged, churches were damaged by direct missile fire. Refugees fled the area. Soldiers and citizens were killed. International observers are still trying to gain access to the sites to verify their condition and ensure their preservation. This very day, the sites that you will hear about today are at risk of disappearing in the fight over the future of the land where they were built. Cultural and religious sites are at risk. As you will see in this exhibit, this is not a political project. Rather, through the exhibition, we hope that people in America especially can appreciate these churches and monasteries and their preservation needs. We also hope that visitors to the exhibit learn more about the people connected to the churches through short video segments, to understand the way that they interact with the sites. These churches and monasteries are not simply beautiful and culturally important. They exist because of and have been maintained by people of faith. And that faith has sustained people, even through years of uncertainty and conflict. And now the ability of people to worship freely at these sites is inhibited. The story in the exhibition is not always pleasant, but it is an important story so that we can learn from each other to live together as a global community, neighbors together seeking peace and understanding, and even friendship with each other, even if we are separated physically by thousands of miles. Later during this program, when I introduce the exhibition, I will thank those who contributed. But first, to help us learn more about these sites, it is an honor to introduce our first speaker, the Very Reverend Proto-Archimandrite Shahe Ananyan. Father Shahe is a priest of the Armenian Apostolic Church and director of the Ecumenical Department of the Holy See of Echmiadzin. He was formerly Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Yerevan State University and Professor of Dogmatics and Historical Theology at the Kevorkian Theological Seminary. Welcome, Father Shahe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like, first of all, to thank all the participants and the contributors of this wonderful exhibition, and for the opportunity to represent the ancient yet very vivid and living faith of the Armenian Apostolic Church, and mainly of the Diocese of ARTSAKH. A lot of you maybe are aware of the situation as Dr. Kloa represented, but I would like rather to introduce you to the very ancient territory that we call now ARTSAKH, and allow me also to share. When I was first asked by one of my friends, Anglican priest, why these churches, sites, monasteries, cultural values are so important for you, I just responded that, you know, these are the ancient monasteries, these are places where we preserved our faith, where we are formed as Christian nation. But then he asked me a very interesting question about the traditions, about the theological, ecclesiological, ecclesial, spiritual meaning of these monasteries. And since then, I started to think myself, what is the real spiritual, ecclesial phenomenon or signification of these monasteries, of these churches that we now are discussing, and what is the need, the importance of these monasteries and churches in ARTSAKH. I would like, first of all, share with you a brief historical note. I just mentioned some very important dates. As you see, the first expression, Caucasian Albania, it's now very actual, because some of the Azeri representatives, so-called specialists of Albanian Church and Caucasian Albania, they are now claiming that this culture was not only Armenian but also Albanian. And that's why I would like to start my presentation with this very notion of Caucasian Albania. And as you see, Caucasian Albania officially adopted Christianity with the Armenian people, with the Armenian nation, just in the beginning of the 4th century. And as I mentioned, the king of this country was baptized in 315, I mean, in the beginning of 4th century. And then you can see, you can read also that the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Albanian Apostolic Orthodox Church were in mutual canonical communion together. And so starting from that very historical point, the Armenian and the Albanian churches created a very unique and special culture, religious tradition that we are used to call now Albanian, Armenian, Caucasian tradition, church tradition. You can see also that some of the Catholicoi of the Albanian church were had their residences both in Armenian territories and in Albanian territories. And you can also see that at the end of the 14th century, the very famous monastery of Gandzasar in central ARTSAKH territory became the residence of the Albanian Catholicoi. And since we used also in the Armenian tradition especially, we used to call also this hierarchy of the Albanian church the Catholicosate of Gandzasar. This brief historical note is very important because I'm sure that many of you participants of this exhibition should be aware and should be informed about what is Albania, what is Armenia, what is Christian Caucasus, because it's very important. Sometimes on the internet we are looking some facts, we are reading some facts about the history, and sometimes, sorry to say, but unfortunately we are also facing some fake news and fake fabrications or transformations of the historical facts. That's why it was my idea to start this presentation with this brief historical note. The last point is very important also because it's about the very important notion that sometimes we are not used to say, but this territory that we call mountainous Karabakh or Artsakh is also the canonical territory of the Armenian Church. I mean, this is one of the dioceses of the Armenian Church, and thus all the monasteries and the churches and cultural monuments are also part of the Armenian canonical territories, church territories, and also part of the Armenian ecclesial tradition. This is very important to bear in mind because, as I mentioned, since 1988, the Catholicos Vazgen I, the late Catholicos, officially also affirmed the canonical statute of the Diocese of Mountainous Karabakh, ARTSAKH, and appointed a newly ordained, very famous bishop, now Archbishop Parkev Martirosyan, as a prelate of the diocese. this is not a creation of the diocese. This is not a new diocese. I mean, this is the confirmation of the historical and very important diocese of the Armenian Church. I would like to, I'm sorry, I would like also to present you a map, an historical map. As you see, just in the beginning of 3rd century, you can see where is Albania, where is Iberia, this is Georgia, and where is Armenia, just to show you some historical details about the territory of the historical Albania. Yeah. The tradition of the Armenian Church concerning the monasteries and sites, churches of ARTSAKH has two main lines. I would say has two main historical layers. I mean, apostolic tradition, which is rather the tradition of the apostolic preaching in ARTSAKH, historical territory of the Armenian Christian mission. And then the second one is the beginning of the Armenian literature and the Armenian literature and theology, and ever first founded Armenian school, which is in fact, and which was founded and which is now in the territory of ARTSAKH. In this slide, in the 3rd slide, you can see legend and tradition of Saint Elisha. I would like to read for you an extract from the very famous work of Moses Dasuransi. This is an Armenian monk, historian of 10th century, and he wrote a very important book, The History of Caucasian Albanians, which is in fact one of the most important sources for our knowledge about what is Caucasian Christianity and what is Albanian Church in general. So the historian says that the Holy Apostle Thaddeus was appointed for us Easterners, I mean, for the Armenians and for all those who were living in Albania, who were living in Georgia. He came to the Armenian canton of Artas, this is now in Iran, and there suffered martyrdom at the hands of Sanatru, king of Armenia, and his disciple, Saint Eliseus, returned to Jerusalem and relating the inviolable martyrdom of his fellow apostle. Thereupon he was ordained in the Holy Spirit by Saint James, the brother of our Lord, who was the first patriarch of Jerusalem. He received the East as his diocese. The blessed Eliseus came to Gis, this is a very famous town in the central part of Albania, and founded a church there. This place was the original source of all the churches and cities and the conversion of us Easterners. As you can see in this book, the historian preserved a very important tradition about the apostolic preaching in Caucasus, and of course, in the eastern part of Caucasus, which we used to call Eastern Armenia. And thus, this very important tradition was preserved in the Armenian Church till the beginning of 17th, 18th century. There is another apostolic tradition about Saint Dadi in Armenian, which is in fact the transformation of the name Thaddeus, disciple of the apostles. In the same book, the historian says, a certain Thaddeus from the pagan converts went to Greater Armenia and to the northern lands by the commission of Thaddeus the apostle, and upon hearing about the death of King Abgar, king of Armenia, turned and moved to smaller Sunik. Sunik is now the southern district of Armenia, and was murdered for secret preaching. The monastery was built in that place and named after him. Here we can see two different traditions of the apostolic preaching in ARTSAKH. And of course, the theologians, the hierarchs, the Catholicoi, the bishops, the Vartabets, archimandrites of the Armenian Church are aware of this tradition. And for them, this tradition, these two traditions, represent the source of the tradition of the apostolic preaching, not only in ARTSAKH, but in Armenia in general. Why I would like to show you these two very famous monasteries, Dadivank Monastery, which was built on the shrines and relics of Saint Dadi, Thaddeus. Fortunately, this monastery is now I would say, under the protection of Russian peacekeepers. This is in the canonical territory of the Armenian Church. And because of that protection now, 6 or 7 monks and deacons have the opportunity to pray there and to preserve this monastery. And the second monastery is St. Eliseus Monastery, which is now, as we used to call in Armenian, an inactive church. I mean, there is no opportunity and there is no possibility to celebrate there because it is in the territory of Azerbaijan now. And this church needs also to be reconstructed. The third very famous monastery, which represents also the unique importance for the Armenian Church, is Amaras, the monastery of Amaras. As I noted here in the slide, there is a very interesting tradition about the name Amaras, which was closely associated with the cult of sun. In Armenian, sun is Arev, and Arevast, abbreviated Amaras, it became Amaras, an expression in Armenian which means that once a year in that place, the sun touches the globe. It's very interesting to see that. I myself, I didn't know about that fact when I visited first. First of all, I was very interested about the name Amaras because I was thinking that it was maybe the transformed name of one of the saints or martyrs, but then one of the guides told me that there is a very interesting tradition about this name. And most probably, I think that that place was previously one of the centers of the pagan tradition and religion of ancient Armenia. And this place is closely associated with the name of Saint Grigoris in Armenian, Saint Gregory in English. And Saint Grigoris is a grandson of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, and also was and is a symbol of Christian mission in Northern Caucasus, because according to the tradition, according to the historians, Saint Grigoris preached not only in Armenia, not only in ARTSAKH, but also in Derbent, which is now in Russian Federation, in some cities and villages of the actual Azerbaijan. Grigoris has been murdered by one of the kings of Albania, one of the masters or princes of the city of Derbent. And then Grigoris' body was taken to the Amaras monastery and buried there in an unknown location. And then at the end of 5th century, a very famous Albanian king, Vachagan III the Pious, recovered Grigoris' relics and buried them in a tomb within the Amaras monastery. And this tomb, till now, is a very important site and place for pilgrimage for the Armenian faithful, because there, according to the tradition of the Armenian Church, started, in fact, the tradition of all the schools in general, of Armenian schools and ecclesial schools of the Armenian Church. I think that even in the beginning of the 5th century, the Amaras monastery was considered as one of the most important Armenian church sanctuaries. And as I noted, the expression of that great veneration, of that great veneration towards the monastery and the tomb of Saint Grigoris, Saint Gregory, was the fact that the creator of the Armenian alphabet, Saint Mesrop Mashtots, who was an archimandrite, a priest and monk of the Armenian Church, established in Amaras the first ever Armenian school. Some of the specialists, archaeologists, historians could show you the place where, according to the tradition, this first ever Armenian school was established. I'm not sure that this is the real shrines or ruins of this school, but anywhere in the Armenian tradition, we preserve this great veneration towards this great Christian missionary who not only founded the Albanian Church as the first Catholicos of Albanian church, but also he became a symbol of Christian mission in Northern Caucasus in general. When I was asked to speak about the churches of ARTSAKH, of course, we have more than 500 or 600 active and inactive churches in the Diocese of ARTSAKH. Now we have only 17 or 18 active churches where the priests, the deacons would celebrate the holy liturgies, services, celebrate the church sacraments. There are only 17 or 18. The rest of the churches are inactive, and there is no possibility now in the aftermath of the ARTSAKH war to go there and to celebrate the liturgies, which is in fact, due to some circumstances, not only political, but also economical also, because these churches need to be reconstructed, these churches need to be recovered as sanctuaries. And then, as I said, from the 10th century in the Armenian church, these sanctuaries, these three monasteries, were considered as one of the as very important places, and Amaras as a birthplace of the beginning of Armenian literature, and the other two churches, Dadivang and St. Eliseus monasteries, as birthplaces of the apostolic preaching in Armenia. I took only these three monasteries in order to represent you the importance and significance, not only cultural, but also religious importance of these monasteries for the Armenian church and for the Armenian faithful in general. The two above-mentioned monasteries, that is Dadivang and St. Eliseus, were often called apostolic, founded by apostles, by the Armenian theologians, historians, underlining that's the unique importance that these churches had and continue to have in the Armenian spiritual and ecclesial life. And even in 19th, 20th centuries, when the Eastern Armenia was under the protection of the Russian Empire and also was included in the territory of Russian Empire, the Amaras Monastery, the churches of Dadivang and St. Eliseus were important pilgrimage places for the Armenian Christian faithful. And I mentioned that recently on 31st May this year, about 6 months after the war in ARTSAKH, as I said, Russian peacekeepers accompanied 117 pilgrims from Stepanakert, and they made also possible this very significant pilgrimage to the monastery of Amaras. And recently, His Holiness Karagin II also visited this monastery, renovating also and confirming also this very important tradition of the pilgrimage to the ever first school in the Armenian tradition. As I said, also in Dadivang Monastery, which is now de jure, or according to the ceasefire agreement in the Azerbaijani territory, about 6 Armenian priests and monks are still living and praying. And we hope that one day it would be also possible to go there and to renovate our tradition of the pilgrimages to the tomb of Saint Dadi the Apostle, which, as I said, is one of the symbols of the apostolic preaching in Armenian. At the end, I would like to show you just 2 cases, the churches before and after the war. You see here St. John the Baptist, called also Green Chapel, Kanach Jam in Armenian, church before and after the war. Of course, the Azeri specialists and authorities are till now claiming that this is the Albanian heritage church. Of course, there is no historical evidence for that. And this is very famous picture because it was made by BBC. Yeah, it is BBC. BBC. You see the church of Mechakavan before and after the war. There is no practically any trace of the church, in fact. And I think that if we continue to be unable to go and to preserve these ancient churches and monasteries, these signs of the living faith of the Armenian people, one day or another, these churches also, these famous sanctuaries of Christian mission and preaching, apostolic preaching in the eastern part of Armenia, will have the same fate. I pray and I hope that one day we could find also the way to be able to preserve, not only to preserve, but also to live in these churches, live our faith in these churches. I thank you for all of you for your attention. And I thank you once again also the organizers of this wonderful exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Shahe. Our next speaker is Professor Christina Moranci, who is the Arthur H. Dadian and Ara T. Oztemel Professor of Armenian Art and Architectural History, and also Chairman of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at Tufts University. She is the author of 3 books and more than 90 articles and essays, including an introduction to Armenian art published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Her 2015 monograph, Vigilant Powers, 3 Churches of Early Medieval Armenia, has won several awards. She has worked on issues of cultural heritage for over a decade, with a focus on the at-risk Armenian churches and monasteries in what is now Eastern Turkey. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Moranci.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks to the Museum of the Bible for hosting this event and for the beautiful show. I'm delighted to be with you here, and I also want to thank Father Shahe for a wonderful presentation about ARTSAKH and about its ancient faith. When I was invited to give a presentation, I thought it would be useful to speak from my perspective as a historian of medieval Armenian art, and more broadly, as a historian of the art of the Christian East, because I think that what's at stake with the potential risks that the monuments face now is there are a lot of things that are at stake. And sometimes that isn't so clear if you're not absolutely immersed in the field. So just to give you a sense of the context, what you're looking at here is a map. This is with this border. This is the area that we are talking about that is at risk. So the dotted lines and then all around here. So all of this, apart from what's in orange at the moment, which is still part of the Republic of Artsakh, all of this part, these green and sort of light green areas are now transferred to Azerbaijan as per the November 2020 deal made with Russia. Now, what this means is not only the handover of acreage, but as Father Shahe already hinted at, the handover of many important Christian monuments. Some of those Father Shahe already discussed. You've heard about Dadivank and Amaras, and I want to mention a few more because I want to give you a sense not only of a loss of Christian monuments, but also a sense of the volume of that loss. So all around this purple area is what is being handed over. So what does that look like in terms of monuments? Well, it depends how you count monuments, but one estimation, which is a count of every tombstone, chapel, church, and monastery is over 4,041 monuments in ARTSAKH. So we still have to subtract the area that is still under the control of Armenia, of the Republic of ARTSAKH, but that still leaves a great number of monuments that are in danger. If we were to look only at a single province of this area that is handed over, we would have a sense of what is at risk. And it includes not just buildings, that is stone buildings, but also inscriptions, sculpture, painting, and of course, everything that churches are, which is they are about faith and about history and about identity. If we take this region, which is again a region of ARTSAKH, of Nagorno-Karabakh that has been handed over, this map gives you a sense of all the main monasteries and churches that are in this region. And these are mostly medieval. So they mostly have a foundation date that might be 9th century, might be 5th century, might be 13th century, but belong to the pre-modern period. And so again, this is only one region that we're talking about. And if we were to put this into the form of words, this is what it would look like. You would have this many sites to be worried about. And that's kind of where we are as art historians of Armenian art. We're worried about this many sites. Again, Father Shahe spoke about a couple of these, and he showed some really gruesome examples of before and after photos of monuments. And that's in our minds as we think about what will happen to the Armenian churches. As an example, I want to show you a church that is called Tsitsernavonk, which is in the region that has been transferred to Azerbaijan. Tsitsernavonk is a 5th, 6th century basilica, and it is an early Christian basilica, a spacious one. If you are familiar with early Christian architecture, you know that the basilica was one of the earliest forms used for church architecture. And we see examples of basilicas everywhere, from the British Isles to Rome to the Christian East. The example of Tsitsernavonk is striking because it is so well preserved. Aside from some periods of renovation, which it did undergo, it basically retains the contours of its 5th, 6th century form. Now, if you study something like early Christian Rome, you would think that an extremely unusual and precious thing, because if you go and you try to find a basilica of Rome that has retained its 5th century outlines or decoration, it would be a difficult task. But Tsitsernavonk does that. It is a precious example of a surviving early Christian basilica. And so here you see the plan on the right, and you can see that it has a series of piers dividing the space into aisles and apse for the celebration of the Mass, and 2 side chambers. It's built with its technique that is typical of Armenian architecture. We call it rubble masonry. It might look, particularly in those bottom courses, like solid stone, but in fact, this is revetment. It's facing stone that is sandwiching a core of rubble and mortar. And throughout historical Armenian zones, you will see this technique formed, used, and exploited to create vaults and domes and really soaring spaces. And Tsitsernavonk is a very good example of that. Tsitsernavonk is interesting too, for many reasons, but one of them is what you see in this photo, which is the apse of the church, but above it is a gallery level. This is unusual, and it's been commented on by professors like Jean-Michel Thierry and Patrick Donabedian, who studied the church and noted how exceptional it was to have a gallery level, a tribune level above the area of the apse. And if you think about it from a theological point of view, to have anything above that most sacred zone is not just a kind of it's an architectural anomaly, but you sort of hard to kind of theologically justify as well. It would be really important to study more carefully this monument for that reason. It would be important to do archaeological investigations as well. So the risks here in terms of losing this monument it's not just about what survives, it's about further investigation and the compromise or perhaps cancellation of any further investigation. And that investigation would illuminate ancient liturgical rites, it would illuminate theology, and it would illuminate something of the experience of an early Christian church, which again is a rare and precious thing. I'm just showing you another interior of the same church, Unveiling. And this one, I've just downloaded this picture from the internet from a site called Monument Watch, but I'm showing it to you because if you look carefully, you can see that there is decoration in this church, some of which seems to retain its early Christian phase. If you keep your eyes peeled even more, you can see that there's some fresco, in this case, surrounding a cross. In fact, Unveiling is covered in frescoes. And again, they haven't been carefully studied. Now we have software tools in order to recover images and in a way tease apart images that might look to the naked eye like they're unreadable or invisible. So that's another thing that for all of us who study Armenian art, we're worried about. It's not just the past of these churches, but it's the future and it's continued discovery. So I'm going to just go forward and look actually at another area. This is just to the north. So we're kind of traveling north in the inlands now handed over to the Azeris to the province of Karvajar. Again, I just want you to note here all the places that we are talking about. It's not just the famous places, it's some of the more modest chapels, but these were of course just as important for the communities that worshiped in them. Again, if we looked at this in a Word document, we would have to list all these chapels and tombstones and cemeteries and churches and monasteries. Father Shahe mentioned at the very bottom, this is Dadivank. Again, a tremendously important site now under the control of the Russian peacekeepers. This is an aerial view of the site to give you a sense of its tremendous natural beauty, which I believe has been beautifully captured also by the Museum of the Bible event, by the photographs. Dadivank is an extraordinary example of Armenian church architecture. It is characteristic in its geometric profiling with the wonderful conical roof and the faceted drum that you see in the main church of the monastery. And the attention to that is very typical of Armenian architecture, that attention to the landscape and the setting of the architectural site in the landscape. And, in this time of Zoom and not so much travel, it makes it even more wonderful to imagine how it would be to go to a place like Dadivank. I have had the good fortune to be there, and I hope that everybody listening will also have such good fortune. There is experiencing medieval church architecture is something that I think has to be done in person. It's very well to look at photographs and plans, but these churches and sites are very much about breathing in the air and seeing the church within its immediate landscape and viewing the landscape from the church. So that connection, which is an ancient connection between the architecture and its landscape, is very important. And for Armenian Christianity, that connection with the landscape goes back to 5th century literary traditions. It goes back to the conversion of Armenia to Christianity in the 4th century. So that's just a little, just to give you a sense of what it's not just an aesthetic connection between architecture and landscape, it's theological and Christological. Having said that, I wanted to show you, this is a plan of Dadivank, and what you see is the monastery within its sort of topographic lines. What's extraordinary about Dadivank is that it has retained many of its medieval monastic buildings, that is, refectories, libraries, monastic utilitarian buildings. And this is unusual for a medieval monastery. Generally, particularly if the monastery is in use, those monastic structures outside of the church are rebuilt and refurbished. But again, Dadivank has retained the kind of medieval monastic fabric, meaning it's an extraordinary example of a place where you can get a sense of medieval monastic life, of everyday life. Another really important reason for this church to be watched and cared for. Yet another reason is its archive of Armenian inscriptions. And I'm just showing you some of those inscriptions here in a couple of drawings. In fact, it's covered in Armenian inscriptions. And these are mostly donation inscriptions, that is, members of the community who have given something, whether it's land or whether it is vessels or whether it is curtains, to the church in return for the monks' prayers. Also, we find commemorative inscriptions, inscriptions that name a person who has died and who wishes to be remembered in the monks' prayers. Each one of these inscriptions requires careful scholarly attention. And in fact, the very drawings I'm showing you give you a sense of the careful scholarly attention this monastery has already received. Nonetheless, there's always more work to be done, and at the same time, we want to understand and respect the pleas that these inscriptions represent. That is, each one of them represents an individual who has asked, who's made a prayer, and so they each one, just like the crosses that you see carved into the wall, needs our attention and care. In addition to inscriptions, Dadivank also preserves fresco painting, and the fresco painting has recently been conserved, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of it here. So this is inside the main church, and you see an image of Christ on the right, the Virgin, Christ on the left, the Virgin on the right, and Saint Nicholas, an image of Saint Nicholas between them, and an angel to his right. Here's a better detail of Christ, showing him giving or handing over the gospel book to Saint Nicholas. This is, again, extraordinary to have an example of 13th century wall painting, and in this case, a style that shows connections to Byzantine wall painting. Another reason for us to study and care about the church. And then I just want to show you the last dimension of what's important about Dadivank, and that is its tremendous sculpted surfaces. You're looking at one of the porticos of the church. This is the west portal, and you can see some of the decoration that's very typical of the 13th century. In the 13th century, you see in Armenian art all over the historical territory of Armenia, a tremendous interest in carving surfaces to resemble geometric patterns or lace. You can look, for example, here maybe and see some of that beautiful kind of lace work. We'll just go forward for a minute. And the most beautiful example of that are the Khachkars, or carved cross stones of Dadivank. Khachkars, which literally means cross stone, is a type of carving practice that in fact is a UNESCO intangible heritage practice for Armenia. And Khachkars exist from all over Armenian territory, and they're still made today. These are two beautiful examples from Dadivank showing Khachkar carving really at its height in the 13th century. When you see how the sculptor has really dematerialized, if you like, the stone and turned it into this kind of carved, very delicate carved fretwork. Just to give you an example from the Republic of Armenia, this is the Khachkar of Pogos from the monastery of Goshavank, again in what is now the Republic of Armenia, from 1291. Similarly, the attention here is on surface design and on creating multiple layers and levels of surface. Here, we have to understand this not just as an aesthetic choice, but as a choice that shapes the way you understand the Khachkar itself and the cross. Khachkars were intended not just to be appreciated, but to be venerated, to be worshipped in front of. They were anointed. They held important power, and they still do. And the idea of meditating, praying before an object like this, in which you can kind of get lost, in which the complexity is immediately obvious and yet very hard to kind of tease out and to comprehend, perhaps an analogy for God. So this kind of aesthetic and also let's say worship practice come together in the Khachkars of the 13th century. And the two from Dadivank are really beautiful examples of this tradition. But there are Khachkars everywhere in ARTSAKH, and I'm just showing you a few examples that are out in the cold, but are also part of this same worship tradition. A very interesting Khachkar was discovered not recently, but in the northern region of Karvajar at a monastery of Handapert. And you see it here along with the wonderful photographer Hrayr Kacharian, whose photographs are being used in this exhibition from the Museum of the Bible. This is an extraordinary Khachkar, not only because, I mean, it's a beautiful example of a carving with the cross and with grapes, referring, of course, to the Eucharist and the blood of Christ, but also because of this little mother and child, or woman and child down below the cross. And here's a detail, and you can see that the mother that is breastfeeding the child. This is an image that is very unusual for medieval Christian art. It might immediately remind one, though, of the Virgo lactans, which is an image of the breastfeeding virgin, which has its origins in Egypt, even in pagan Egypt, but then certainly also in Coptic iconography. In this case, it's not sure. We're not sure. There is a very good argument that this is actually not the Virgin and Child. There's no halo. She is not dressed in a kind of particularly glorifying way, nor is the child. So it could be that this is, in fact, as Hamlet Petrosian has argued compellingly, a mother with her deceased child, and that child is being remembered here in this Khachkar. But I would say alongside that, its position within the monastery would have meant that for anybody praying in that monastery, they would have been reminded, because of the Christian context, of the breastfeeding mother par excellence, that is the Virgin Mary. And here I'm showing you a 14th century manuscript of the Virgin Mary, an Armenian manuscript, where the Virgin is breastfeeding the Christ child. And to make very clear the liturgical meaning of this, very evident, we have the archangels holding out their chalices to this pair. And that theological connection between the milk of the Virgin Mary and the blood of Christ is made by early church fathers and then also by Armenian mystics. So there's much to learn from ARTSAKH, and in a kind of very wide spectrum of areas of knowledge. And the worry, of course, as Father Shahe has already reminded us, is of the kinds of destruction that are happening right now, and also what has been destroyed in the past with Armenian monuments under the control of Azerbaijan. And this destruction, which it takes various forms, from complete erasure of a monument, as we saw in Father Shahe's presentation. It also takes the form of removing inscriptions that identify, and here you can see an effaced inscription, identifying a monument as Armenian. It also takes the form of actually destroying sites, cemeteries, tombstones, and then reincorporating them into new buildings. And an example that is in the show is the Tsar School, which was made in around the 1950s. And it is made of, it's very gruesome. It's made of Armenian tombstones and inscriptions and sculpture. And these are just put in pieces along the walls of this school. And again, this is a documentation of all the places in the walls where these tombstones and inscriptions, really fragments, spoils of Armenian churches and cemeteries have been inserted. It's very difficult to imagine, having grown up in the United States and, going to school in a regular building, what it must have been like. This school is now, pretty much abandoned. What it must have been like to study in such surroundings. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but let me just see. These are some details of the school and of the spoliated fragments. I think that I won't say much more than to say that the region of ARTSAKH has received centuries of interest on the part of Armenian scholars. And here I'll go back all the way to the 15th century, and where we have a manuscript that it was actually made in ARTSAKH. And but it's not just the manuscripts that were made and repaired there. We have foundation inscriptions, we have academic documentation and engravings. So that's the good news. There's tremendous amounts of documentation to help us understand this region. But of course, there are always new questions that we need to ask. And without the standing monuments, without those, all we can do is speculate. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that the study of medieval Armenian art is becoming more and more interesting, I would say, to scholars of medieval art and of Christian art. And I think that's only going to continue. On top of that, I think that the current conflict, if it's done anything, it's made people aware across the world of the fragility and the power and the importance of what might seem a little corner of the Christian world. There's so much that we have to learn, and the only hope is that that the monuments will stand in order for us to keep doing that work. And I just wanted to show you, maybe I'll end with the just to say that in museum collections across the United States, we can find examples of objects from areas that are no longer under Armenian control, like this beautiful clerical vestment that's now in the Armenian Museum in Watertown, that actually tells us it was made for a church in Nakhchivan, which is now no longer under, it's church that's destroyed. And it is, so that this object is really the only trace we have left of that community that worshiped in the church. And this is a textile, a beautiful early modern textile. So I think with that, I'm going to close and just again thank the Museum of the Bible so much for this wonderful and important show. And I'm really excited about how much this will do to convey to people the importance of the fragile and beautiful tradition of Armenian ARTSAKH, or Nagorno-Karabakh. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morency. We'll take a few minutes to give a brief tour of the exhibition. Of course, it's online, so we'll do this virtually, and then we'll close with some remarks from Ambassador Session. Briefly, the website is titled, the exhibit is titled Ancient Faith, the Churches of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the invitation to explore the sacred places of Christian culture and stories of the people who have lived and worshiped in ARTSAKH, known internationally as Nagorno-Karabakh. If you scroll down, we feature 7 sites with monuments, some of which Father Shahe and Professor Morency have already discussed, and we'll dip into one of those in a moment. If you scroll down further, we give a little context on the geography, the location of the sites within the region. Keep scrolling down. And then a brief history of Christianity in Armenia and in this region. You can scroll down a bit more. And a little bit of the recent history regarding the conflict. Scroll down a little bit more. Of course, the language, down a bit more. And then we discuss the current risk. So a bit of an overview of the context, but the main feature are the monuments at the sites themselves. If you can go back to the top there, Will, please. We'd like to show you one in particular as a sample, and this was brought up both by Father Shahe and very much by Professor Morency, is Dadivank, a beautiful site. And just to give you a preview, if you scroll down a bit to some of the images, some of which Christina showed you, some top views, which can be zoomed in, continue down, different views, and notice how it's set in its location in a very attractive way. Some of the history of the site and the inscriptions, and really pleased that we were able to include images of the inscriptions, and then further down, even images of manuscripts that were produced at this site from the Middle Ages. So showing the long history and contribution of this monastery to really world history and world culture. And we did include also in the exhibit for each of these 7 sites, brief videos that show how people from these areas are connected to the church sites, so that they're not only static old monuments, but living and used by people. So we'll show you one brief video clip for Dadivank. I'm very pleased with this video. Thanks.
լրություն ադիրում ով որ գալիս է իսկապես աղմուկ չկար այդ նույնիսկ այդտեղով անցնելիս երբ որ արդեն պատերազմն ավարտվեց գալիս էինք ճանապարհը դեռ բաց էր բոլորը գիտակցում են որ հեսա պիտի տեղով անցնեք քար լրություն էր տիրում բոլորը ուզում էին նայել ինչ որ բան ավել մտապահել այդ հանգստությունը իրենց հետ տանել կամ չգիտեմ այդտեղը մի ուրիշ հանգստություն է տալիս իսկապես
Սկզբում ուսումնասիրում էինք տեղանքը, այնուհետև բաժանում էինք խմբերի, ամեն խումբը զբաղվում էր իր աշխատանքների կատարում։
Մեկ խումբը աշխատում է օդից, դրոններով, ընդհանուր տեղանքը նկարահանելը, մեկը ներսում էր աշխատում, մի խումբը ներսի մասերը, սենյակները ու եւ այլն, մի խումբն էլ դրսում էր աշխատում։
Մենք մեծ մասամբ ձգտեցին այնպես անել, որ 3 խմբերներ տեղեկություն ունենան բոլոր սարքավորումների մասին, կարողանանք վերջնական արդյունքը ստանալ։
Այս օնլայնը շատ լավ է, որ մարդիկ բոլոր աշխարհի ծայրերում կարող են տեսնել ու ծանոթանալ հայկական մշակույթի հետ։
Անելուց չենք պատկերացնում, որ ինչ որտեղ դա առաջին հերթին մեզ պետք գա, իսկ հիմա մենք հնարավորություն ունենք նորից թեկուզ եւ օֆլայն լինել դիվանքում։ Ամբողջ կյանքդ ապրել ես մի տեղ, որ մտածում ես ապահով է։ Ճիշտ է, այդտեղ կռիվ եղել է, բայց հիմա տեղ ապահով է, ոչ մի բան չի կարող լինի ու մինչև կյանքի վերջ sense կապրես, բայց գալիս է մի օր ու դու արթնանում ես ոչ թե տնային կենցաղային ինչ որ աղմուկից, այլ չգիտեմ, ԱՑՍ-ների հարվածներից։
Սարավտ մտածում եմ, ինչ շենք ենք անդում, ինչ բան է, ձայնը, բայց հետո հասկացա, որ Կիրակի օրը ժամը 7 առավոտյան չի կարող էլի այս ժամին Կիրակի օրը ինչ-որ շենք քանդեն, ասացի ինչա, միայն մայրիկի դեմքից է հասկացել, որ պատերազմը դե ինքը առաջ պատերազմի ժամանակ այստեղ է ու այդ ձայները ճանաչում է։
Սկզբի օրերին չի պատկերացնում, կռիվը ինչ է, չէի ուզում հավատալ, որ իսկապես տենց բան կարող լիներ, ընդհանրապես մտածում եմ, որ երազա, չգիտեմ, հեսա որ որակ ավարտվի բան, բայց պատերազմից հետո ասացին, որ դա մեր քայլեջարները անցնում իրանց տիրապետության տակ առաջին հերթին վանքի մասին մտածեցին։ Մի կողմից էլ լավ է, որ մենք կարողացանք այդ վիճակում ֆիքսել, հա, վանքը ու հետագայում եթե Աստված չանի ինչ-որ բան լինի, կարողանանք ապացուցել, որ այդ վիճակում չէր։
We invite you to explore the other sites and monuments on the website. Very grateful that it's actually on the website now, so it worked. Some things work technologically. I do want to briefly thank the many contributors to this project, and it was a wonderful team and very renowned. So the academic advisors and scholars who contributed and advised and reviewed include Patrick Donabedian from Aix-Marseille University, Igor Dorfman-Lazarez also from Aix-Marseille University, Yasmin Dum-Tragut from University of Salzburg, Roberta Irvine from St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary, Rachel Goshgarian from Lafayette College, Sergio Laporta from Fresno State University, Theo Martin van Lint from Oxford University, Christina Moranci from Tufts University, and Hamlet Petrosyan from Yerevan State University. Also like to thank the Armenian General Benevolent Union for supporting the documentary video project, And images were provided by Harar Hawk Kacharian, Hamlet Petrosian, Joseph Dagdigian, and the Mezrach Mastoch Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, the Matanat Iran in Yerevan. So we're grateful for their support. And also, I'd like to thank many people involved in the project internally and some partners, volunteers even. Laura Satrakian in Yerevan for her really tireless efforts to bring this together. Arpin Gregorian and our internal creative team and curatorial team here at Museum of the Bible. Very grateful for their efforts on this project. We're planning an exhibition of Armenian culture, especially related to the Bible, but its long Christian history for March of 2022. We've been slowed, of course, by COVID and this war was not helpful, to say the least. We're very excited to have that in process and coming in March of 2022. The title of the exhibition is Breath of God, which is kind of a literal translation of the Armenian word for Bible. And we're looking forward to that and encourage you to come back to the museum in March of 2022. And of course, we're seeking help and support with that project as well. Thank you again for joining us. If I could close briefly with the way we conclude the exhibition online with a quote from His Holiness Karakin II, the Supreme Patriarch and Catholicos of the Armenian Apostolic Church, where he, quote, calls on the rest of the world to bear witness, to pray for peace and justice, and perhaps even to go to see these churches themselves someday. I hope those are all fulfilled. Thank you for joining us.